Going.
All good.
Okay.
Oh, and tell me, once we do get going, are you looking for one clean run through, or is it okay to have edit points?
No, if you want to have, I mean, I'd be easier because I don't have. This is me doing this off my own back. I don't think I've only got particular resources. But if there's anything where you go, no, that you can't use that, then
Okay.
I'll find a way. I
Right,
do
yeah.
have a freelancer.
No, all good.
Amazing. Okay, so I'm Vijay Solanki, and today I get this very exciting and slightly amusing opportunity to turn the tables. And I'm joined by Tim Burrowes, which anyone who's any part of the Australian, New Zealand media and marketing scene will know well. The purpose of this conversation is to talk to Tim and ask him questions about his journey as a news media startup founder. Hello, Tim. How are you?
Hey, Vijay, I'm very well, thank you very much. And it does seem a bit ironic that we're both actually in the same city for once, and yet here we are doing things virtually.
I know, but and this way we get to easily capture this conversation and share it amongst a group of founders who I think will be eager to hear to what you've got to say. So let's take you back. And I remember, and we've talked about this once or twice, you've got, like me, British roots. And I remember that you were a journalist for Media Week, but it would be fantastic if you could just spend a minute or two on your backstory, how you got into journalism, what you've done, and what triggered you to start Mumbrella, how it came about.
Yeah, sure. So I've been a journalist for my whole career since I was 18. So I started back in 1989. So I'm one of the few still working journalists who trained on typewriters, I suspect. So my first few years of my career was as a print journalist on local newspapers. That sort of good old traditional broadsheet weeklies, then on to sort of multi-edition dailies. And then I guess the first sort of twist in my career was to move into kind of business publishing. Initially, that sort of world of B2B was actually on a magazine called Hospital Doctor, which was a weekly magazine, very unprofessional. My phone just went ding, so I'm going to turn the noise off so it doesn't do that again. So a magazine called Hospital Doctor, which was about the politics of the NHS in the UK. So I was actually there for about 6 years. Eventually became the editor, and that was probably the first sort of, I guess, big and not non-automatic career move I made, where I went from editing Hospital Doctor to editing Media Week magazine. And I think when someone is hiring an editor, they have two choices really. They either hire somebody who already knows the beat very well, but hasn't necessarily got the editing skills, or they do the opposite. And I was lucky enough that they took the risk on me having the editing skills, and that I would then build up the beat knowledge, which honestly, it coming into covering the media, and the sort of media and marketing world, it probably takes a good year before you even realize how little that you actually know. So that was sort of back to, I guess, covering my own world in much the same way as.
And was that a deliberate move or an opportunistic move into media?
I had been absolutely fascinated by media, so that whole time that I was on Hospital Doctor, my homepage was set to Media Guardian, so it was my own world. I think maybe in the same way that when I was on local newspapers, it was my own world. So look, just always incredibly interested by that world, because you're writing for your peers, which has its pluses and minuses, but about a fascinating world to me anyway. So I did a couple of years or so on Media Week, and the Media Week in the UK was very much focused on the sort of the connection point between media agencies and media sales. So it's all about the business, and really focused on the business of media. And then after a couple of years of doing that, I was asked to be the launch editor of Campaign magazine in Dubai, which covered the whole of the Middle East. So that was my introduction to, as well as writing about media, writing about the marketing world and the creative agency side of the world. And then by then I'd always decided I'd be away from the UK for a year or two. So it was about time to go back to the UK. And I think I've been back in the UK for about 2 or 3 weeks when I had the offer to come and be the editor of B&T magazine, which at the time was still a print product. It was weekly. It was still a long time since it had been known as broadcasting and television, which is where the B&T came from.
I didn't even know. That makes so much sense.
No, it took me a long. It took me a long time to work it out as well, and of course it dates back to the days when people thought that broadcasting and television were two different things, and that was my entree into the Australian scene. Did that for exactly 2 years to the day, in fact, because that's what I promised I'd do, and then after that had the opportunity to be part of the team that launched Mumbrella and was the first employee.
Right. So where did the idea for Mumbrella come about?
In part, it was a natural evolution of everything I'd always done in trade press publishing, but online. And by then I'd become really interested in certainly the blogging side of things, which, I'd started a blog when I was on Campaign Middle East. So that was it was nowhere near the first, but it was relatively early. So that would have been about 2004 or something. So, that was a world I was becoming kind of increasingly interested in. So the initial thought was that maybe what we would do is we would super serve individual audiences within that kind of wider media and marketing world. So, we had the terrible idea of doing a series of weekly PDF newsletters, one for media agencies, one for maybe people working in creative agencies, one for marketers and so on. And the idea was that, Mumbrella would just be some sort of political, where the content would live after we'd sent out the newsletter, which fortunately the blogging side of Mumbrella, and it was just a WordPress blog initially, that was the bit that really took off. So we never actually did the terrible PDFs idea.
Right, but that was the plan. And what you're saying, you didn't go into production with the PDFs?
The thought was, because we launched in it was actually early December by the time we launched, so there didn't seem much point launching newsletters at that point of the year. So this was December the 9th, 2008. We kind of thought, okay, well, we'll probably launch in February. And by then it was taking off like a rocket ship. We were getting so much interaction, so many comments. Again, it was as Twitter was coming through and there was a lot of sharing going on. So it really felt that we'd found a formula that was working. That the immediacy was really exciting for me. It felt almost because you were publishing so many articles each day and getting so much immediate feedback. That felt like the where we'd found a moment. So that we
So in that sense, was it successful? Or certainly the blog was successful from the get-go, from day one.
In finding an audience, yes. In commercializing it, no. We really struggled to commercialize it initially. So we, after a while, we, began to do a few small events, and they would find a sponsor, and we'd sell a few tickets. So these would be like a breakfast event with a panel of 4, and they were great for community building. But one of the problems we had breaking into an established trade press set was everybody else was still selling print advertising. And it was actually, back then, I mean, it sounds ridiculous now, it was actually quite a pain creating digital ads, particularly for one new product. So that was actually one of the barriers, as we were quite soon into the market. So that was one thing. And then another thing was just the market dynamic was a lot of the kind of people whose heartland was print, and that included B&T, where I'd worked, and it's something I'd found frustrating. They would tend to give away the digital advertising, just sort of so long as someone took an ad in the magazine, So yeah, it was quite different times to today, I suppose.
Yeah. No, it's kind of reminiscent of many traditional media companies, not going back that many years. You know, it was analog dollars and digital dimes, I think, if you remember. What gave you the confidence to launch with digital back in 2008?
Um, I I think about it now, and I think I was probably a little naive, actually, and a little foolish, because I was on a good wicket. I was being quite well paid at B&T. So I suppose the one thing was I joined a couple of business partners who were already in the publishing game. They specialised in the travel trade press. So one of them was an owner of TNT magazine, but then as a sort of sister company, they had this thing already, an off-the-shelf company called Focal Attractions, which was publishing something called Backpacker Trade News, which was trade news for the adventure and backpack industry, and they were running an awards, and it was making a little bit of money. So when I joined, I joined as a shareholder in that company. So I suppose the fact that I was joining something which was already mildly profitable probably de-risked it a little bit for me. Although I look back now and I realise it was probably riskier than I realised at the time.
Right. So who were your co-founders?
So my co-founders were Martin Lane, who I had first very briefly crossed paths with in the UK, actually. He'd been a fellow editor of Travel Weekly at Read Business Information at the same time that I'd edited Hospital Doctor. And although we maybe sat next to each other on a couple of courses, we didn't really know each other. But Martin had then ended up in the UK as publisher of B&T. So Martin had then ended up in Australia as publisher of B&T. So it was actually through somebody we knew in common that Martin sort of hired me into Australia to come over to B&T, and then he promptly left to go over to work on TNT magazine until we got together again a couple of years later. And then the other person was Ian Wakeling, who had been the general manager of TNT magazine, and when the owners, which was kind of indirectly the Guardian, when they pulled out of Australia that time round, he was sort of left holding the baby, so ended up the publisher of TNT.
Got it. And how was it then? So you co-founded this with two people you'd never really worked with.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so Martin obviously lost the connection for a moment. Can you hear me now?
I can.
Can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me? I think we're back. Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I think we lost the connection for a minute there, or we did at my end anyway. I'll go from that question if you want me to, Vijay. Yeah, you're right. I hadn't actually worked together with either one of them for any significant amount of time because Martin had left B&T not long after I joined. But we stayed in touch. So yeah. Look, I everything I know now about co-founder dynamics is the advice is try and know quite well the person you're going to co-found with, and I think that's probably good advice.
And how did you go about sort of shaping the content value proposition? Was that clear? Actually, two questions. One was that, and two, the notion of Mumbrella. Like, how long had that been percolating, or did it come together quite quickly? So the idea, how long had that been around, and what was the journey to get that to get the content value proposition right?
I suppose, I mean, sometimes the unthinking sort of journalistic answer is, well, it was just instinct. Although, of course, what that really is honed by experience. So, by that point, in 3 different markets, I've been, writing for people, in the communications industry over at least, 5 or 6 years, but had also had a decade of experience as an editor and of the publishing dynamics of business publishing, and again a fair bit of time sort of on where digital was going. So it was actually to me, it was an obvious next step where I applied a lot of what I'd already learned about the dynamics of B2B publishing, and just happened to be using it in in different medium, and then leaning into that medium and the immediacy of it. But in the end, the central thing that I'd been taught everywhere, on local newspapers, on Hospital Doctor, on Media Week, was your focus has to be on the audience. They're the people who are you value your advertisers and treasure advertisers, but really the audience is your customer. Certainly, if you want to have a kind of business model where it's about building audience and building it quickly. It was all stuff I'd been taught along the way. And then, putting it into practice and experimenting. And, over the years, we've tried plenty of things that didn't work as well. But it just so happened that we picked our moment where WordPress just became mature as a platform. So that actually, even a couple of years before, you'd have probably had to, mortgage a house and, printed a magazine. As I was saying, Twitter was just coming through. And that was really great because the sort of people who were on Twitter then were the sort of people in our industry, or at the cutting edge of our industry, the sort of early adopters. And it was also just as email became cheap, and email became such an important amplifier for us because, we'd post something, I'd tweet it, begin to get a bit of a comment thread going and a conversation. And that meant that when we then sent out the email, there was already a conversation going, and the conversation tends to go where the conversation is. So it sort of just became this sort of self-feeding thing where those three things played in. And there was hard work and experience and all of those things, but also the timing was right for doing that particular product at that particular moment.
Right. So that alignment of planets between blog, email, and Twitter, and was that, how did that become clear to you? Was that clear at the outset? Did it take a bit of time? You went, oh, hang on, it's these three things in terms of creation and distribution.
I think it actually took quite a long time to figure out how fortunate we were. And the funny thing is now, and maybe we'll talk about this later, as I now do Unmade on the Substack platform, and it's going fine, it's going quite well, but it's also, we're going with the trends, whereas last time round it was absolutely rocket fueled. We had all of the wind behind us, so we exploded into the market, and also we had the space to ourselves. At the time, and this sounds crazy to say now, Ad News and B&T were very much had it in their head that their model was, it was a daily publication, and the worst possible thing would be to give away your scoop. So if they had a great story, they'd sit on it until the other one had published. And sometimes they'd be locked in this kind of weird battle where it would get to 5 o'clock and neither one had published. And just by going, at that point, going at lunchtimes, we had so much clear air. Now, I know that sounds ridiculous in this kind of pollution that we have on our inboxes now with so many newsletters, but again, it took them a year or two to respond. So again, we just we found some momentum. So
in that sense, is there one of, one might argue, one of the oldest principles of news media at play, which is he who gets to the story first, or she who gets to the story first, is going to win to some extent?
Yeah, particularly I think when it's the issue that's going to catch the imagination on the day. Now, sometimes that's an exclusive, but sometimes it's just the thing that everyone's going to be talking about, in the in working in the office that day. So getting to it first. So I always had a sense, particularly when something was evolving, where the web was really great as well, and still is, would be publishing multiple articles as things develop, sometimes a number of articles on the same day, because that was again where blogging was really great for. And 2 days later, by the time people were kind of lumbering into print, we'd already moved on, and the conversation had moved on as well. But yeah, there was definitely a time where the immediacy was really important.
Going back a step, what was it like taking the leap away from a regular paid salary into a world where perhaps there was no salary, or it was an unpredictable world? How was that for you? Was that an easy decision?
Look, I mean, again, I was probably naive. So if I remember rightly, I went from a salary of about $120,000 on B&T at the time, which was, more than it sounds now, in 2008, to I think I was on 60 when we started at Mumbrella. So at least there was,
Right.
there was a living salary. And, I at the time, not married, no children, no responsibilities. So I was able to make it work. And probably, again, just didn't really think about the perils that it might have held, probably as much as I should have done. If I'd had a mortgage to pay, it probably would have been a different matter.
Right. And going back to the alignment of the planet, blog, email, and Twitter, could you share some light on kind of the journey to building capability and I guess ultimately mastery of like how you figure out? And the reason I ask is I guess we've got a bunch of founders here in 2022 who are looking at all of the digital media technology that's in front of them and trying to figure out which to use and how to use it. So how did you go about making them really work for you back in the day?
One of the good bits of advice I got somewhere much later was, make deliberate choices what not to do as well, because obviously there were so many channels, for instance. And I suppose the other thing that we did was, because I always wanted to build a business, not just a publication. And one of the things I would always be arguing for is what our next hire should be. So for instance, when events became a really important part of our business model, because you get people who buy tickets, but people also uh, choose to sponsor to talk to that audience, and it became clear that probably we needed a curator. So for a year, I stepped back from doing other things, and I was just the curator of all our events as we began to grow them and launch them. And and that was a good case study. And then that gave us the confidence that actually we should hire someone just for that to be their job. And then similarly, when I was making the argument that we would sell a lot more tickets if we actually had a marketer, and I know it sounds so obvious, but we were just using our editorial channels as our only means of marketing tickets to our events. So for a year, I stepped off the news desk completely and was just our marketer. Which in those days was super basic. It was just things like making sure we had the right messages in each day's email, that we had the basic, ads up, that we had a few EDMs together. But yeah, so again, I did a year in the cycle as the marketer, which gave us confidence to then say, okay, this will pay for itself, so we can, hire someone who's better at it and better trained than me. And again, I think what I found was, it gave me enough understanding then that I could have an intelligent conversation about that part of the business. Similarly, hey, look, I went and did over a few weekends, I did some video editing training when we were doing more video. And although I never did much hands-on video editing, it gave me the language to have the conversation with the members of our team who did. Because, I would at least be able to say, okay, can we, edit this piece of video to the beat, or whatever it might be, the things that you'd sort of just learn the basic principles. So yeah, I think, a lot of it was finding ways of at least, getting your hands on to a certain extent. And then of course, yeah, hiring people, as you grew, who could do it better than you.
How did that feel? I mean, part of the startup cohort we've got there's a fair chunk who have a journalistic background, and you are throwing yourself at skill sets that you don't know. So how did that feel, and how did you make that work for you?
Look, it's the further you get away from journalism, the more uncomfortable it is. The more because the addiction of writing is there's always another deadline and something else you can write, and the immediacy, and then of course that satisfaction of getting an immediate response to it. So I'm exactly the same today. I will, now that I'm doing, Unmade, and I'm having to kind of run the business side of it on the side as well, I will make a million excuses not to open Zero when there's something else I can write instead. Because you lean into what you're comfortable with, of course, but somewhere deep down you have the to-do list and you have to get to this stuff. So you have to find a way of getting to this stuff at some point, particularly in the early days when there isn't someone else who can do it.
So how did you get to that point? What was your trick?
Look, I think in the end, as I say, I had co-founders. So Martin was active in the business and Ian was a sort of silent investor. So very broadly, Martin would run the business and I would run the product, and that also included kind of the marketing side of things as well for the early days of it. So there was a division of responsibilities, and we were very different sort of personality types as well. Although we were both sort of journalists by background, Martin had already gone the publisher route, whereas I was very much about the content, and of course, in this case, the content absolutely was the product.
Now, you've talked a little bit already about people. First hire, who and why?
Yeah, very first hire salesperson. And actually, she'd moved across. She was already in the building because we were sharing office space with TNT, which was, had some common ownership, but was under separate ownership. And that was actually gradually what happened was as TNT faded and Mumbrella took off, the staff would gradually move across. But yeah, the first thing we probably did wrong was we hired a relatively inexperienced salesperson who didn't know the market. And as a result, it was really, really hard to monetize in that. We got some support, but the big move we made was we brought on a fourth partner, shareholder, salesperson who'd been a salesperson over at B&T, so already knew the market, had the relationships, and that made that was a key moment. That was a real big difference when Sean came across and joined us as a fourth partner.
Got it. And the relationship between sales and perhaps actually a more fundamental question is the business model. You talked about, you got really quick engagement with the content, figuring out the business model. Could you shed some light on your journey of business model experimentation?
Yeah, look, I'm glad to say that quite early on, we began to make some money from programmatic, in that we organised conferences about programmatic and decided not to touch it as a publisher at all ourselves.
There I was thinking, really? What, in 2009? Right, that's brilliant.
Yeah, no, I could never figure out when we were getting really high CPMs why we should possibly touch programmatic, and we didn't. One of the things about trade press is you're delivering a small, very niche audience, but a valuable audience to the right advertisers. So you've got to ask the right price. And for us, that was we went to a CPM model quite fast, but that was one always sold by human salespeople. And then quite quickly, the event side of the business came along as well. First with small events, and then with increasingly big events. So Mumbrella 360 became our biggest event. And that was that hit a point where over the sort of 2.5 days, more than 3,000 people were coming through the door. And of course, that was one where I think in the years where I was really, really proud of the content, it was I was so proud of the quality of the curation of the content. We were getting some really great international speakers, so people were actually willing to buy tickets to an event where in an industry where they aren't always, but also we were getting really good sponsorship as well for the same reason.
How long did that journey of kind of iteration, test and learn then take for you, in terms of, I don't know when you did the first 360 or the precursor of 360 to its kind of Nirvana days? What did that look like?
Well, the first Mumbrella 360 was 2011, and again we launched it we ran the first one in the June, and completely naively and idiotically we only launched it in the February, which is absolutely an insane thing to do. But luckily, we didn't realise it was an insane thing to do, because otherwise we'd have waited more than a year before we did it. And again, because we were really noisy about what we were doing, we really got the industry involved in the curation of it. Built a community around it. It made it that first year, and it was a lot of, there was absolutely nothing smooth about it. It was kind of, years later, when we had a much larger event team and there were critical path documents and all those things, it became something which fed itself, on a kind of yearly cycle. But in those, it was just myself and, our one events person just in the office until crazy hours. So that, that first year, the model was there right from the first year. It was,
Right.
it was multiple streams, it was multiple topics. The idea being that you could bounce between the streams and hopefully there'll be something at any given time that will be interesting. And it was the idea that it was where everyone in the industry comes together in one place. But again, not a completely original idea.
Right.
Back in the day on Media Week, we did something called Media 360.
I remember back in the UK. Well,
Yeah.
Was there a certain trigger point or metric or feeling that said, yeah, we're ready to do this and we think we can make this work?
Feeling is probably the right word. And again, I think that's the thing, is it's, we're good editors, and obviously I'm just talking about, the business of publishing, which is quite a niche, but where good editors have a business head are really good is they know their audience, and they have a feel for what they'll accept when they're ready, all of those things. So I think that was just the instinct, is I think we can do this now. It's a bit like when when we were launching an awards, for instance, there was just that, is the market ready for another awards? So it was all about, okay, well, what does the market lack? Which at the time was one that was really well, thoroughly judged, making sure that the people who win absolutely deserve to win. So it was all about making it harder to win than any of the other, because that felt like what the gap and the need was, which was just an editorial instinct, really. I think the problem is you can get paralyzed with research, where when you're doing something new in a market, there's nothing you can research, really. You can end up spending a year looking at everybody else's rate cards, but if they're not doing already what you're thinking of doing, then you're not going to get the information. So sometimes you just got to try a thing and fail. And there are plenty of events that don't exist anymore because they failed, or they went through their cycle. There are publications we launched that died. So there's lots of things that we tried and failed with. So we learned plenty of a few cheap mistakes and plenty of expensive mistakes as well.
Frequency is an important principle, I guess, in any sort of media company. How did you figure out the frequency model for Mumbrella?
I think I'd answer that in two ways, or come up frequency in two ways. Number one is absolutely with Mumbrella, the more you published, the more audience you got. If you had something, it wasn't just about the daily email. And I think the fact, once we hit a daily rhythm, that definitely speeded things up. But sometimes it was just the fact that, some days I'd publish 10, I'm quite a fast writer, 10 or a dozen pieces a day sometimes, and in that early blog light days, sometimes there'd only be 3 or 4 paragraphs. It was just, what journos would call a one fact story, but it was just keeping things ticking over and moving. And that was in part because you were trying to build a habit where people would come back all the time because they're expecting to see fresh content. And if you kind of think about your own behavior on particular sites, the ones you go back to more regularly, the ones that you go there because you're expecting something fresh every time you land. So it was, yes, frequency was important, but it was probably in service of creating a habit. And I guess where I began to think about that again with my sort of later period of my time on Mumbrella was I started writing a Saturday email, which I just always made sure I always hit send or set it up to go at 10 past 10 in the morning on a Saturday. And it was just never, once I started, never missing a Saturday, always doing it, and it wasn't particularly commercial, but it was a discipline, and it was a habit, and it was a new way of talking to the audience. And to this day, now that I'm writing Unmade, you will find that my best of the week email on a Saturday, the time slot has been vacated, so it will drop at 10 past 10 Eastern every Saturday.
Fantastic. Tim, I'm conscious we've gotten out of time. I would love to come back to you. There's still a few unanswered questions. I'm also, to be frank, about to be kicked out of this room because of the time slot that I booked it in.
Well, that's my fault for coming online late, so I'm to blame for that.
No worries. No, I've captured lots of really useful insights. So firstly, thank you. And I hope I can grab you again for a few minutes at some point to get.
Yeah, my pleasure, mate. Just shout whenever. Yeah.
Okay. All the best. Thank you so much. That was super cool.
No worries, mate. Thanks
for
the invitation.
Thanks. Bye.
Cheers, mate.